Hello everybody, welcome back to Norwich Talk for another match preview. We're here today to talk about Norwich City's upcoming game against Swansea. A massive game for Norwich on Friday. Tomorrow, of course, really, really big. I cannot overstate how important this game is to Norwich City's season. Not that I really need to. Swansea currently sit just below us in the league table in second. In today's video, we're going to go over my starting lineup and a few final thoughts ahead of the game. If you want a more in-depth analysis, I would recommend that you go and watch the podcast that we did live. A live podcast, wow. A big thanks to everyone who commented in the video as well. It was a really enjoyable experience, and we'll definitely be doing that again. But if you want a more in-depth analysis ahead of the game tomorrow, then I'd go and sort of point you in that direction. This video is very much sort of a snippet of that, as well as a preferred 11, as is often the case in these videos, of course. The 11's next to me now. We've got Tim Krul, Dimitris Giannoulis, Ben Gibson, Grant Hanley, Max Aarons, Ollie Skipp, Lucas Rupp, Mario Vrancic, Todd Cantwell, Onel Hernandez, and Teemu Pukki. For me, I think there's not really much up for discussion in terms of the backline. I want to keep that the same. There was a few calls on the podcast for maybe bringing Jacob Sorensen back, which I think was probably fair enough because we looked a little bit more sort of defensively sound with him. Although, that said, we haven't conceded with Giannoulis in left back. I'd very much like to see him progress. I think this could be a very important game for him. Alfie made a really good point in the podcast in that Connor Roberts on that right-hand side isn't going to be man-marking anyone. He's going to be really high up the pitch. This could be a great opportunity for Giannoulis to sort of exploit that space down the left and really prove his worth and show Norwich City what he's about. Fingers crossed that can happen. Ben Gibson, Grant Hanley, really fantastic players. The two best players against Millwall, which was a pretty sort of dreadful performance, wasn't it? Really boring to watch. But Sam made a really good point in the podcast, which I've only sort of learned to process now, which is that someone, I don't know who it was, he never said, but he said that someone compared it to the 4-0 loss at Millwall at the Den before, but we've got a solid defence, so we didn't concede them 4 goals this time, whereas if we didn't have Ben Gibson and Grant Hanley, maybe we would have, which I think is actually a very valid point and a very interesting one at that. But those two guys, absolutely fantastic. Tim Krul in goal, of course. Max Aarons in right back. I want to see a bit more from him. I've seen a few people point out on Twitter that he hasn't been particularly brilliant lately, which I do agree with, to be honest with you. He is also one game away from suspension, which is interesting in terms of if he was to pick up that yellow card and pick up that one match ban, how much of an impact that would have on Norwich City's team. In the middle, I've gone for Ollie Skipp and Lucas Rupp. Skipp has to go in there, brilliant player, love him, want to enjoy him whilst we still have him. Genuinely still gutted that I won't be able to see him play for Norwich in the flesh unless he joins on loan next season if we were to get promoted to the Premier League. That's clutching at straws, so I'll stop doing that. Lucas Rupp for me against Millwall was actually pretty good. And what I did notice against Millwall and Borough as well is that he quite cleverly fills the pocket that Giannoulis leaves when he's sort of venturing up the pitch. And this was something I pointed out before, and Hodgie did on the podcast recently as well, in that Norwich's problem on the when they're being counter-attacked is that they have these high fullbacks and there's a massive gap, and we haven't really seen that that much this season, but we saw it in the 1920 Premier League season. We saw loads of goals conceded from that sort of play, and for me, I think Lucas Rupp has that intelligence to fill that gap. He did that really well, which is probably why I'd start him over McLean. McLean, for me, probably maybe the better player. I don't know, it's up for debate. Both players have had sort of dips and peaks in form this season, haven't they? But I don't really trust McLean to fill that space, to be honest with you. And in a game that is going to be won in the midfield, I want to stick with Lucas Rupp, who's probably a safer pair of hands. And as I said, I thought he was actually pretty decent against Millwall. I usually look at SofaScore off the recommendation of Alfie. SofaScore, great website, which gives players ratings, and Lucas Rupp's wasn't that high, which did surprise me, to be honest with you. I don't know if I'm alone in thinking that, but he looked really comfortable on the ball. He's really good at dribbling as well, which sort of often surprises me, and he's an engine. He loves to give the ball as soon as he gets it, which is, as I always say, it's a really important part of the way Norwich play. Which is why I've gone for Lucas Rupp. Mario Vrancic in the 10 for me. I don't know if I'd start Kieran Dowell. I don't really know how I feel about Kieran Dowell. He's obviously been struck by injury. He's been quite unfortunate during his time at Norwich. The number 10 position is a position that Norwich haven't filled properly since the end of the 18-19 season. Obviously, when we got promoted, we were all hoping it would be Marco Stiepermann to step up. He didn't step up. That was a shame. McLean's had a go there. Vrancic's had a go there. We've now signed Kieran Dowell. I say now signed. Kieran Dowell's on his way back. Hopefully, he can make it his own unknown, but I'm going to go with Vrancic for this just because I really like Mario Vrancic. And I saw a few calls on Twitter for him to sort of drop back into the 8 again, but I don't really want to see that, especially in this game, because that then relies on his sort of defensive solidarity. And I know he would probably have Skip next to him, but equally, I don't want to do that. And I like seeing this new form Mario Vrancic where he gets the ball when he dribbles, he takes a few players on. I mentioned this in the podcast yesterday as well, where he just glides past a few players at times, which is really weird to see. It's quite new considering he's been here nearly 4 years now, which is really interesting to see him developing, of course. So yeah, I'm going to go with Vrancic there. I'm going to stick with Todd Cantwell. I really want to see him turn his recent performances around. Obviously against Millwall and Middlesbrough, he was pegged back, he was man-marked, he was frustrated, and as Alfie said on the podcast again, the Borough performance was a bit of an advertisement in terms of this is how you stop Todd Cantwell, and I think Millwall and Gary Rowett perhaps learned from that and thought, right, this is how we do it. They did it really well. He obviously got very frustrated, unnecessarily slated on Twitter. I mentioned on the podcast, some people like to see him fail, which is really weird, but we're not going to get into that. I do believe he'll turn it around. We've seen flashes of a brilliant player this season, so hopefully he can turn it around. I don't think I'd really put anyone else in left wing at the moment. Now, I think the most... I surprised myself with this one, to be honest with you, in that Ono Hernandez on the right wing. I've gone for him instead of Pochetta because I just want to see a player get the ball and play with a lot of confidence. Now, I know I said against Millwall Pochetta was looking a bit more confident, but if Ono Hernandez is cleared for the full 90 or to start a game, you absolutely have to play him. Hernandez isn't a Premier League quality player. I don't believe that. I don't think many do. But at this level, he's a very, very good player. And I always say that you don't really have to be particularly brilliant at shooting because you're going to get many chances. We saw Norwich against Millwall have 17 shots. If Hernandez has a few, I'm sure he'll find the net at least once. And I just want to see someone with that championship experience lead the line, and take the game to Swansea. And as we mentioned earlier, they play this sort of, I say earlier in the podcast, sorry, they play this sort of three at the back where I think Hernandez could have a lot of joy, where theoretically he could be lining up against whoever's on sort of the left side of the fence or right side of the fence, potentially Ryan Bennett, and he's not very quick. So if Hernandez can exploit that and use his pace, I think that'll be really, really important. And up front, I've gone for Timu Pukki. Really wasn't that great against Millwall at all, was he? He didn't look like he sort of really knew when to shoot, which is very uncharacteristic of Timu Pukki, let's not get that wrong, but at the same time he's a really important player to Norwich and we don't really have much choice but to play him, which isn't a bad thing, let me stress that. In the podcast yesterday there were a few comments saying that we should start Adam Eder. I don't think so. I want to give Pukki another run in a massive game. We know that in the Championship before he scored in loads of big games for Norwich. I want to see him do that again. I want to see him prove himself, and I'm sure he'll be full of hunger and desire to do that. And in the worst case, you just bring Adam Eder on, who is, of course, 19 years of age. He has so much to prove to the fans and to himself, I think, and he's sort of this young prospect, isn't he? Very raw talent, and if you're bringing that off the bench, which in Norwich City's case, that would be, in my opinion, then that's only a positive thing for me. In terms of injuries as well, I should mention, or absentees, obviously Sam Byram's still out, Marco McGovern's still out, Jordan Hugill sadly, Marco Stiepermann of course, and Emi Buendia is serving the second and last match of his suspension. We'll miss Buendia massively, but I don't want to get bogged down into that because that's just sort of an endless spiral really, isn't it? Missing Emi Buendia. Now, they're my thoughts on the starting 11. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. What I'm going to do quickly is I'm just going to run over what we know about Swansea because I think it's important to do that for those of you who don't want to go and watch the Swansea podcast, which, it's fair enough. But last time we played them, we beat them 1-0 at Carrow Road, didn't we? Massive goal from Marco Stiepermann in the 84th minute. That was Ballymumba's game and Josh Martin's game where they came on and they impacted the game massively. That hallmarks Daniel Farke's faith in the youth for me, in that was such an important game for Norwich. And he brought on Ballymumba and Josh Martin, two very inexperienced young players who effectively won us the game. Ballymumba shining the brightest out of the two, of course. I'd love to see him play like that again. That performance alone has given me enough reason to believe he'll be a very, very good player and a very important player for Norwich City. I've got here in front of me that I described it as the Jamal Lowe horror show. Obviously, since then, he's learned to find the net. He had a good 3 or 4 clear-cut opportunities against Norwich, which Tim Krul was equal to. I was just sat there scratching my head as to how on earth has he not scored. Their recent form is win-draw, win-win draw, which is decent. Much like Norwich, they're undefeated in the last 5. I haven't actually looked beyond that, although this season, again, they've had a similar season to Norwich and they've played 26 times, 14 wins, 8 draws, 4 losses, 33 goals. on average, and 15 against. So they're not scoring that many, but equally they're not conceding very many, which explains why they're second in the table. They average 1.3 goals per game, like Norwich again. Maybe a similar season, although expectations, I can imagine, are incredibly different between the two sets of fans. Freddie Woodman, 14 clean sheets in 25 games is sublime. Really good goalkeeper. 23 years of age. I believe he's on loan from Newcastle. I think Freddie Woodman was in the same squad as Kieran Dowell that won the 17s World Cup, which, suggests that these players are starting to come through. Obviously, we saw Dominic Calvert-Lewin at the beginning of this season properly start to emerge. I know he's been around for a while, but he's starting to properly find his feet. That generation of English players are really starting to prove their worth at the moment, which is good to see. As I mentioned earlier, Jamal Lowe, top goal scorer with 9 goals. Andre Ayew behind him with 8. Now, what I think is quite interesting is behind Andre Ayew, so the third top goal scorer, is Cabango, and I believe he's a centre-back, and he's got 3 goals. So not that many players are chipping in with goals, which was a situation Norwich found themselves in last season. And there's been a few points made. I honestly can't remember for the life of me who said it on Twitter, but they said that more players need to start chipping in with goals this season, which I think is fair enough. And that probably would explain why Norwich are only winning games by a goal, sometimes 2, very rarely 2 goals. And we've scored 3 goals twice in a game, which isn't particularly great. My last point on Swansea is that they typically deploy, as I mentioned earlier in the video, a sort of a 3 at the back, 5 at the back, whatever you want to call it. The main thing to note is there's 3 centre-backs, 2 very high-flying wing-backs, one of them being Connor Roberts. Alf described him as the best offensive wing-back in the league. Haven't really seen him play, but I'll take his word for it. I trust the guy. So it could be very interesting to see him potentially exploit Norwich's fullbacks in terms of their defensive abilities. Obviously, he'll be down that right-hand side, so it'll be Janulis attacking / defending against him, which could prove an interesting battle. I remember when Janulis signed, it was well documented that he couldn't defend. So it could be a very tough day at the office for him. That could incline Daniel Farke to perhaps go with Jacob Sorensen, which when you've got Janulis of, a player of that pedigree, and Jacob Sorensen, who's been playing really well in left back, is sort of it's a manager's headache, isn't it? And that type of headache's a good one. But that's all we know about Swansea. In terms of my final expectations ahead of the game, I'm not feeling too optimistic, but equally I don't want to be pessimistic. I see this one maybe finishing as a 1-1 draw. I think it will be probably one of the better games of football that we see, or equally it could be incredibly boring in that both teams just retain possession and maybe look afraid to attack each other. That is very much a possibility, but equally I don't think it's going to be a case of Swansea turning up, parking the bus, lumping the ball forward, bringing Matt Smith on with 2 minutes to go, lumping the ball forward towards him. So in that regard, I'm excited to watch Norwich tomorrow, but equally, as I said, I'm very nervous. I have absolutely no clue what the score could be. Maybe a 1-1, as I said, but you really can't predict the Championship, can you? This could be a season-defining game. I think I'm going to label it as a season-defining game, which isn't too groundbreaking. But equally, if we are to walk away with this without a win, without a point, then I don't think the season's over. The season's never over in the Championship. But let's be positive. Let's hope Norwich City can pick up 3 points. In the comments down below, leave your thoughts, leave your starting 11, your opinions on whatever I've said. You can abuse me if you want. I don't care. Just leave a comment. That would be great. If you could give the video a thumbs up as well, I'd really appreciate that. If you could subscribe to the YouTube channel too, that'd be pretty awesome too. So until next time, we'll see you again very, very soon.